He came to claim a ranch, but instead 7 women were waiting, each holding photographs of him they should never have had. What secret did his grandfather hide here? And why does this land feel more dangerous with every step? Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you walked into this? And if you love stories full of mystery and danger, make sure to subscribe. Now, let's ride into the story. The road ended before the horizon. Dust rose in lazy plumes from the narrow dirt path, drifting toward the late afternoon sun that had begun to tilt low in the sky. I had ridden for hours without seeing another soul, and yet when I crested the last hill, the ranch appeared as if it had always been there, tucked into a valley so remote that it seemed almost impossible someone could have lived here all this time without me knowing. I dismounted slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders loosen only slightly as I stretched my legs. My horse snorted, stamping the dry earth with hooves that left shallow indentations in the packed dirt. The ranch itself was strange, too well kept for a place I had been told was abandoned, too familiar for a property I had never visited before. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, curling upward as if signaling some quiet, patient life within. Laundry hung neatly on a line strung between 2 posts, swaying gently in the warm breeze. And then I saw them. 7 women stood on the porch. Not a single one of them familiar. Not a single one I had ever seen in my life. Yet when they looked at me, it was with recognition that chilled me to the bone. Each held a photograph. A single photograph. Of me. My face, the way it looked now, caught in every shadow of light and detail that made the image impossible to ignore. My heart kicked up, thundering in my chest. How could they have these? How could they know? The oldest woman stepped forward. Silver hair fell in a thick braid down her back, catching the sun as she moved. Her smile was easy, practiced, but her eyes were sharp. They saw everything. "You're late, Silas," she said, voice carrying over the sun-warmed boards of the porch. "We thought you might not come at all." The younger ones murmured amongst themselves, fingers tracing the edges of their photographs, eyes flicking between me and the images like they were trying to match memory with reality. One of them, with auburn hair and green eyes that glimmered with suspicion, lifted her photograph closer to my face. The resemblance was uncanny, almost unsettling in its precision. I wanted to speak, to tell them there must be some mistake, that I was just a man who had inherited a ranch he barely remembered. But the words stuck somewhere in my throat. I remembered the lawyer's call. The lawyer had said it had been abandoned for decades. Empty. Waiting for me. Not these women. Not this careful, deliberate watch that stretched across the decades in their quiet, tense expectation. I dismounted fully, my boots crunching against the gravel. "There must be some mistake," I managed to say. "I just inherited this place. I don't know how you have these photographs." The silver-haired woman's smile faded, replaced by an expression that held something I couldn't quite place. Pity? Sadness? Both. "Oh, child," she said softly, as if speaking to someone who had lost their way in the woods. "There is no mistake. Your grandfather told us you would say exactly that. That you wouldn't remember at first. That you would need time." I stepped back toward my horse, my mind trying to catch up to everything I was seeing. These women, all 7 of them, had been here for years. Waiting. Watching. Preparing. For me. And yet I remembered nothing. I remembered my grandfather, yes, but only in flashes of warmth and confusion. A man whose presence felt distant, whose promises had faded like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. The woman with dark hair, younger, her hands roughened by work, stepped closer. She spoke with a desperation that made my chest tighten. She said that my grandfather promised I would come when the time was right. promised I would take care of what he could not finish. My head spun. What had he left unfinished? What responsibility had I inherited without knowing it? Then the auburn-haired woman's voice cut sharply through the tension. "You look like the pictures, yes," she said, voice taut with suspicion. "But you could still be lying. How do we know you're really him?" She held up her photograph again, eyes scanning my face with an intensity that made me feel exposed, as though every secret I had ever hidden might be written plainly on my skin. I swallowed hard. 7 women. 7 photographs. 7 pairs of eyes that seemed to see far more than I knew myself. This was no ordinary inheritance. This was something I had never imagined, and something my grandfather had deliberately prepared them for, without me ever knowing. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney behind them, carrying the scent of burning wood into the warm evening air. The ranch, so still, so calm, seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my first move. I realized, with a sinking sense of inevitability, that I was not just here to claim property. I was here to step into a story that had been written long before I had even been born, and one that I could no longer escape. The porch boards creaked under my boots as I followed the women inside, though every step felt weighted with the unspoken history of the place. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, aged leather, and something subtler, a faint trace of perfume or herbal smoke that had settled over decades of quiet vigilance. My eyes darted around the room, trying to take in every detail without seeming intrusive. Every surface seemed carefully curated, yet not for show. These weren't decorations. They were markers, reminders, something like a diary of their lives woven into the walls themselves. Photographs hung on every available surface. The mantelpiece, the walls, shelves cluttered with frames, stacks of old albums, even a wooden chest pushed into a corner. And all of them, every single one, was me. Not as I had been years ago, but as I was now. Faces frozen in moments I couldn't recall, in places I didn't recognize. I picked up one from the mantel, my fingers trembling slightly. It was me, maybe 10 or 11, standing beside my grandfather outside this very house. I remember the house. Or at least, I thought I did. The memory was blurred, as if seen through a veil of fevered dreams from a childhood illness I had barely survived. "Your grandfather brought you here many times," Maggie's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. She came closer, her presence calm, yet impossible to ignore. Her eyes held decades of patience, but there was an edge, a knowledge that this room, these photographs, were only the beginning. "He said the fever took those memories from you. Said it was probably for the best, given what happened that last summer." I swallowed, trying to understand. What happened that summer? My voice sounded foreign to me, tentative, as if my own memories were being held hostage. Maggie didn't answer directly. Instead, she gestured toward the wooden chest, the one that looked like it had been crafted specifically for secrets. Clarabelle, dark-haired and steady, had already moved toward it. Her hands lifted the lid with care, revealing a trove of old photographs, leather-bound journals, and what appeared to be children's clothing, each piece small enough to fit someone no older than I was in the photos I had just seen. I picked up a small hat, familiar in a way that hurt to recognize. The brim was frayed slightly, the leather worn soft from long use. I lost this. I whispered, though no one had answered. The recollection of childhood illness, of blurred days in a feverish haze, surged faintly in my mind. I could almost remember holding the hat, wearing it under the sun while someone's voice guided me through this land. Someone I barely remembered. Mercy, the youngest of the women, approached carefully, holding a small leather journal bound with string. Her hands shook slightly, and I realized it was from the sheer weight of the past and responsibility, not weakness. She extended it toward me. "He wrote everything down," she said softly. "About you. About us. About what he promised. Someday you would need to understand. Someday, when you were ready." Clarabelle's voice cut through, firm and unwavering. "Not yet." She moved to intercept the journal, her expression a mask of caution and distrust. "Anyone can look confused and pretend not to remember. We need more than photographs to be certain. More than memories. We need proof that you are the one we've been waiting for." I felt the room spinning slightly, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. Every photo, every article of clothing, every scribbled note seemed like evidence of a life I couldn't place as mine. And yet, everything resonated. There was a rhythm here, a connection that pulsed beneath my skin, tugging at a thread I didn't know existed. Maggie moved to the fireplace, retrieving a small wooden box hidden behind logs that had likely never been disturbed in decades. She opened it with hands that trembled slightly, revealing a child's drawing. Crude stick figures stood in front of a house that matched this very one, and at the bottom, scrawled in unsteady handwriting, were the words, "My friends at Grandpa's house." I felt the world tilt. This was me. It had to be. I remembered, or almost remembered, the pencil in my small hand, the careful attention with which I drew each figure. But as with so much here, the memory was just out of reach, teasing me with fragments that refused to become whole. Maggie's voice softened, almost reverent. "The last time you were here, you promised us you would come back when you grew up. You said you would take care of us, as your grandfather did." The weight of that sentence pressed down on me. How could a promise made by a child, a fragment of memory, demand fulfillment from the man I had become? Clarabelle and the others watched me, silent, expectant. Each of them carried a history I couldn't yet read, a story woven into the very walls of the ranch. And in that silence, the truth began to settle in my chest like a stone I could neither lift nor drop. These women had built their lives around a child's promise, a child's vow, and now they expected me, the man I had become, to honor it. The sun had begun to dip behind the mountains outside, slanting golden light through the windows, illuminating dust motes like tiny spectres dancing in the air. It should have been peaceful, almost serene. Instead, the atmosphere felt charged, taut with anticipation. I realized slowly that the ranch was alive in ways I hadn't expected. The land itself seemed to sense my presence, to acknowledge that the air had finally returned. And then a sound tore through the quiet. Hooves, heavy and deliberate, striking the dirt outside with a rhythm that made my stomach tighten. The women tensed instantly, their bodies moving with practiced alertness. I froze, feeling the sudden weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. "They're here," Maggie whispered, though her voice carried a sharp edge of fear. I could see it in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also relief. Relief that I had arrived. Relief that I might stand where my grandfather could not. Clarabelle was already moving toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace, checking its ammunition with hands steady despite the rising panic. Mercy peered through a crack in the curtains. "3 riders," she reported softly. "Same ones as last month." I realized then that my grandfather's promises had not been sentimental. They had been practical, protective, survival. These women had been waiting not for me as a man, but for me as the continuation of his plan. And the riders outside, they were the first threat in a long line of dangers I would have to confront. I had arrived unprepared. I had no skill in defending property against men armed with intent. Yet the weight of expectation, of legacy, of forgotten promises pressed upon me like iron. And as the light of day faded, casting shadows across the room, I knew that leaving, even if I wanted to, was no longer an option. The sound of hooves against hard dirt had shifted from a distant threat to something immediate, punctuating every thought with a drumbeat I could not ignore. My pulse matched it, each beat hammering against my ribs as I glanced around the room. The women moved with a precision that betrayed years of preparation, every motion fluid, rehearsed, yet tense with anticipation. I felt like an intruder in a story I didn't remember writing but had been living in all my life. A story written by a grandfather I barely knew and 7 women who had known more about me than I knew about myself. I took a slow breath, trying to gather some semblance of control. My hands shook slightly as I picked up the journal Mercy had attempted to hand me earlier. The leather was worn, soft from handling, and the string binding it was frayed at the edges, evidence of decades of careful keeping. I opened it, my eyes scanning the handwriting of a man who had meticulously recorded the days, months, and years that I had missed. Each word was weighted with the gravity of a man who knew his time was finite, who knew the dangers that would eventually come for the women he had protected. He had written of my childhood visits, of how he had introduced me to each of them, teaching me to tend the animals, to mend fences, to recognize the subtle signs of storms that could strike without warning. There were entries detailing long afternoons spent in quiet conversation, his voice guiding me in lessons I didn't fully understand then, lessons I now realized were about responsibility, vigilance, and trust. I had been a child, yes, but he had already seen the man I would need to become. Maggie's voice drew me back from the journal. You need to understand, Silas. These men outside, they are not ordinary threats. They have been testing the land, testing us, for months. They know the ranch's value. They know what it represents. They have no intention of leaving peacefully. I turned to look at her, the weight of what she said pressing into my chest like a physical force. Why me? Why now? My voice sounded small, almost fragile in the tension-filled room. Because, she said slowly, her eyes never leaving mine, your grandfather's promise did not end with him. He knew the moment would come when the land needed someone to stand between us and them. He knew you would have to remember, or at least act as though you did. I swallowed hard, trying to reconcile this with the fragments of memory that teased me. A faint image of a summer day flickered in my mind, the sun high, a field of wheat swaying in the breeze, my small hands clutching a worn hat as a woman's voice guided me. Which one? I couldn't tell. And yet, the feeling of belonging, of duty, anchored itself deep within me. Clarabelle approached silently, her hands steady as she checked the rifle once more. They are testing the windows again, she said, voice low but taut with urgency. One of them is trying to find a loose latch. If they get in, all of this will be for nothing. I felt a surge of panic. I had never been in a situation like this, never faced men who intended to intimidate and take by force. Yet I also felt the pull of responsibility. These women had waited for me. They had maintained this land, defended it silently, year after year. And now, the burden that my grandfather had left behind demanded I act. Mercy peered again through the curtain, her face pale in the flickering light of the dying sun. 3 of them, just as before. But tonight, they're different, desperate, bold. We've never had them test the house like this after dark. I nodded slowly, setting the journal down carefully. The pieces were beginning to align. The photographs, the journals, the clothing, the faint memory of my childhood. I was part of this story whether I remembered it or not. And the danger outside? That was no longer hypothetical. That was immediate. I moved to the front window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. 3 men stood in the yard, their shadows elongated by the sinking sun. Guns hung loosely at their hips, confident stances and smirks that screamed entitlement. They weren't just land speculators. They were predators, circling their prey, testing the waters before striking. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. The ranch, the women, my grandfather's promises, they were all interconnected. Every detail, every memory I had lost, every scrap of evidence meticulously preserved, had a purpose. They had prepared me for this moment. And though I was untrained, though I had never faced this kind of violence, I understood something vital. If I did nothing, everything my grandfather had protected, everything these women had built their lives around, would be lost. Maggie stepped beside me, her hand lightly brushing my arm. "We've survived for years," she said softly, "but we've been waiting for the right person to stand with us. That person is here now." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The words of the journal, the photographs, the faint whispers of my own memory, they all converged into a singular, undeniable truth. I was the heir not just of property, but of duty, of protection, of promises made long before I had even learned to speak in full sentences. The men outside began testing the strength of the front door. The sound of metal against wood, the creak of hinges under force, echoed through the room. Clarabelle raised her rifle, steady as a rock, but I knew that even her skill might not be enough. And in that instant, I realized that the coming night would be a test not just of strength, but of ingenuity, courage, and trust. I turned to the women, each face etched with expectation, fear, and hope. I didn't have all the memories. I didn't understand all the promises. But I understood one thing. They were counting on me. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, the pulse of something long dormant stirred within me. It was resolve. I had been brought here not just to inherit land, but to inherit responsibility. And whatever came next, I would not fail. The rhythm of hooves outside had become a drumbeat in my chest, echoing in a way that made every nerve stand alert. I could feel the weight of the rifle in Clarabelle's hands, the subtle trembling of Mercy's fingers against the curtain, and the tight set of Maggie's jaw as she assessed the front yard from her vantage point. I had always imagined arriving at my grandfather's ranch as a quiet, almost ceremonial event. Paperwork, a handshake, maybe a few inherited mementos. I had never pictured the ranch as a fortress under siege, or myself as the one standing at its threshold against 3 armed men. My gaze swept the room again. Every object here seemed to carry more than just a memory. It carried instruction. The journals, the photographs, the carefully preserved children's clothing, they were all fragments of a plan I had only begun to piece together. I picked up the small hat again, feeling the familiar worn leather against my fingers, and for a fleeting moment, a memory surged. A sun-scorched afternoon, my grandfather's voice urging me to run to the barn, a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to grasp it, but the memory slipped away, like sand through clenched fists. "Silas," Maggie said quietly, her eyes sharp, "you'll need to help us. This house won't withstand their persistence if we stay passive. They're testing us, yes, but soon they'll strike in earnest. And if they get inside—" her voice trailed, leaving the threat unspoken but palpable. I nodded. The responsibility pressed down like a physical weight, yet a strange clarity settled in my mind. The journals, the photographs, my fragmented childhood memories, they were guiding me, even if I didn't understand exactly why. I realized slowly that the answers to my questions would come only through action, through stepping into the role my grandfather had prepared for me long before I could comprehend it. Clarabelle's voice cut sharply. "They're trying the back again. The loose latch we fixed last month. It's under test." She moved with precise efficiency, checking the windows and doors, a soldier in a quiet war. Her confidence contrasted sharply with my own uncertainty, but I realized something vital. I had to trust them. I had no choice. They were my guides, my allies, and in some ways, the last link to a past I barely remembered. I moved toward the front door, brushing past the heavy wooden bar that secured the entrance. Each step seemed louder than it should have been, echoing against the walls, announcing my presence. Outside, the men had shifted positions, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. Guns low, eyes sharp, they circled, testing, probing, waiting. I felt a flicker of fear, natural and honest, but beneath it, a rising determination that I hadn't known I possessed. Maggie stepped beside me, her hand brushing my arm with a reassuring touch. "Remember," she said softly, "your grandfather believed you would know what to do. He believed in this. In you." The words settled in my mind like a seed, growing roots of resolve. I realized then that I had been brought here not just to inherit property, but to inherit vigilance, courage, and the continuation of a legacy that was larger than any single person. The men outside began testing the windows again. The sound of scraping metal and shifting would made my pulse spike. Clarabelle adjusted the rifle, taking a slow, steadying breath. Mercy ducked behind a chair, her eyes wide with fear. And I, standing there, grasping the edge of the wooden bar, felt the first surge of action. I remembered something. A fragment, just a flicker. A shadow of my younger self running across the yard with a makeshift slingshot, a warning from my grandfather to always observe before reacting. The memory was incomplete, yet it guided me. Observation. Awareness. Patience. The men outside were bold, but overconfidence was their weakness. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. The first move had to be mine. Quietly, I signaled to Clarabelle and Maggie, a gesture learned from instinct rather than instruction. The women understood immediately, positioning themselves where they could defend without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Mercy clutched the journal to her chest, eyes wide, but nodding in understanding. I opened the door just slightly, enough to peer out without revealing my full figure. The men were scanning, their focus sharp, but not complete. I noticed the uneven ground near the back fence, a small rise of dirt that could obscure movement. I whispered directions to Clarabelle, pointing to positions they could use for cover and observation. The women moved silently, fluidly, like shadows blending into the landscape. And then I heard it, a sharp, metallic snap from the back window. One of the men had found the weak point. Clarabelle's rifle raised instantly, her finger steady on the trigger, but the action had to be quick. My mind raced. There was no time to hesitate, no room for error. I grabbed a piece of firewood from the hearth, heavy and solid, and moved toward the hallway where it would give me cover. I had no training, no battlefield experience, yet the instinct my grandfather had instilled, through years of childhood lessons and carefully preserved memories, guided me. Timing, awareness, and resolve, these were my weapons. The sound of breaking glass echoed, sharp and jarring. Clarabelle fired a warning shot, the report loud in the quiet evening air, and I realized something essential. These men were testing more than just the doors and windows. They were probing our patience, our discipline, and above all, our resolve. I felt a strange connection to the ranch at that moment, as if the land itself was urging me forward. Every shadow, every creaking board, every object in this house, it had been preserved for this night, for this confrontation. And for the first time, I understood the depth of my grandfather's foresight. I could not fail them. The sound of shattering glass cut through the tension like a blade. My pulse jumped, my chest tightening as adrenaline surged through me. Clarabelle's rifle rang out immediately, a sharp report that echoed across the yard, and the men outside ducked instinctively, but only for a moment. They had expected resistance, yes, but perhaps not this quick, not this coordinated. I gripped the firewood tightly, feeling the rough grain bite into my palms, and moved toward the hallway. Shadows fell across the floorboards, dancing in the flickering light from the fireplace. Every step I took, every movement, felt deliberate, each instinct guided by fragments of memory I hadn't fully understood until now. My grandfather's lessons, long forgotten, had been encoded in me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Observation first. Patience second. Strike only when necessary. A piece of broken glass clinked against the floor from the back window, and I caught a glimpse of one of the men trying to push inside. Clarabelle's next shot rang out, precise and controlled, and I realized the edge of fear that had threatened to freeze me moments ago was fading. The women's trust in me, their expectation, their survival, it demanded action, and I had no choice but to rise to it. I could see Mercy behind the chair, clutching the leather-bound journal like a talisman, her face pale but resolute. Her presence reminded me of why I was here, not for property, not for inheritance, but for them. They had waited for me, believed in me, and now it was time to honor that faith. Movement at the back window drew my attention. I saw the figure trying to force entry, and instinct guided me. I hurled the firewood with a strength born of desperation, and it connected with the man's shoulder. He stumbled, swearing, retreating just long enough for Clarabelle to reposition and cover the window again. The other two men outside exchanged quick, calculating glances. They weren't fools. They were experienced, and they knew when to push and when to wait. And then a memory hit me, sudden and sharp, as if a veil had been lifted. I was 7 or 8, standing on the very same porch with my grandfather, his large hands resting on my small shoulders. "Silas," he said, voice steady and commanding, "sometimes the world will come at you faster than you can run. You will need to stand, even when you feel unprepared. You will need to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The words reverberated in my mind, a map for navigating the chaos outside. I wasn't just acting on instinct anymore. I was acting on legacy, on lessons passed down in the quiet moments of my childhood. The firewood felt lighter now, an extension of my resolve rather than a blunt object. The men tested the front door again, levering at the wooden bar, their confidence palpable, their intent clear. I moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but also scanning for weak points, for anything I could use to turn the tide. My grandfather had prepared these women, prepared this ranch, for threats that went beyond the ordinary, and I realized now that preparation was both physical and psychological. Every nail, every plank, every hidden tool had a purpose. Maggie's voice broke through my concentration. "Silas, the loft. Quick. There are supplies there. Emergency measures your grandfather kept. You'll need them." Her eyes held urgency, but also calm. She knew I was beginning to understand, beginning to step into the role I had avoided my whole life. I darted toward the loft, finding the trapdoor just as she had indicated. Dust motes danced in the air as I lifted it, revealing a cache of supplies. Lanterns, oil cans, a few old but reliable firearms, and several canisters of powder for the stove. My heart pounded, not just from the danger, but from the realization that my grandfather had anticipated this night, had prepared for my arrival, and had left me the tools to meet it. Below me, the sounds of movement continued. Clarabelle and the other women had taken positions near the windows, their eyes sharp, their breaths controlled. Mercy clutched the journal tighter, her knuckles white, and I, standing in the loft, felt a strange combination of fear and clarity. I could do this. I must. Another window shattered at the back, and I caught sight of a shadow moving inside the perimeter. One of the men had managed to slip partially in, testing our defenses further. I grabbed one of the lanterns, swinging it down with deliberate force. The light blinded him momentarily, and the sudden movement caused him to stumble, buying us precious seconds. Clarabelle fired again, her aim true, and the man cursed as he fell back into the shadows outside. I felt the memory of my grandfather again, his hands steady on my shoulders. "Stand when you are needed," he had said. Fear is not weakness. Fear is the signal to act with clarity. Clarity. That was what I had been lacking. Fear had clouded me. Hesitation had slowed me. But now, with the women prepared beside me, the journal guiding me, and fragments of my childhood lessons emerging, I could act with purpose. I could protect them, not because I was ready, but because readiness was irrelevant. The moment demanded action, and action had to come from me. The men outside paused, reassessing. They were skilled, ruthless, and calculating. But for the first time, I realized we were not simply reacting. We were orchestrating, maneuvering, controlling the battlefield within the confines of the ranch. Every decision mattered. Every movement could change the outcome. And I understood fully that this night was only the beginning. I could hear their breathing, the subtle, cautious rhythm of preparation beneath the quiet panic that hummed in the room. Each of the women had moved into position, their familiarity with the ranch's layout evident in every movement. I realized, almost painfully, how little I had understood about what my grandfather had entrusted to them, and by extension, what he was now entrusting to me. The land itself seemed to resonate with the moment, the wooden floors and thick stone fireplace echoing the urgency in a way that made my pulse synchronize with the distant thump of hooves outside. I called out softly, though my voice carried through the room. Positions, windows, doors, cover points. Clarabelle, Mercy, Maggie, you know your spots. I'll monitor the entrances and coordinate from here. My words felt strange in my own ears, yet as they followed my instructions with near-perfect obedience, the truth became undeniable. I had assumed a role I had never sought, but one that was now unavoidable. The journal from my grandfather lay open on the table near Mercy. She adjusted its position for me, her eyes wide, and I realized its contents were more than just memories. They were strategy. Pages detailed the land, the defenses, past encounters with intruders, and subtle psychological manipulations my grandfather had used to dissuade aggressors. Every detail now made sense. The concealed compartments, the reinforced windows, the careful placement of tools that doubled as weapons. He had planned for my arrival, planned for this night, and now it was my turn to execute his intentions. A sharp crash from the back window drew our attention. One of the men had pushed too far, trying to test our patience and exploit our hesitation. Clarabelle's rifle barked, precise and controlled, and the man fell back into the shadows. I moved quickly, instructing the others to adjust positions. Mercy, still clutching the journal, peeked over the edge of the table, her hands trembling but her resolve evident. I felt a fragment of memory flicker in my mind. A sunlit afternoon years ago, my grandfather guiding my small hands as we reinforced a fence, explaining the importance of vigilance. The lesson had been mundane then, almost tedious, a child's chore. But now, standing in the shadowed room, facing real threats, it crystallized into clarity. Vigilance was survival. Observation was strategy. Patience was power. I motioned for the women to create a perimeter, using the furniture and layout to their advantage. Maggie's calm, authoritative presence became my anchor, guiding us through each movement with practiced precision. Clarabelle's hands were steady on her rifle, her eyes sharp and calculating. Mercy, though younger and less experienced, had absorbed every lesson she could from years of anticipation and preparation. Together, we became a unit, a single force bound by necessity, legacy, and trust. The men outside had regrouped, their silhouettes shifting in the dim light. They were experienced, confident, but not omniscient. I realized that our advantage lay not in brute force, but in preparation, knowledge of the terrain, and the psychological edge of being unexpected. They assumed we were untrained, passive, but we were anything but. A sudden movement near the front door caught my eye. One of the men tried to pry the wooden bar loose, testing our resilience. I took a deep breath, remembering the journal, remembering the small hints my grandfather had left throughout my childhood. Timing, precision, and resolve. I grabbed a weighted lantern and swung it with deliberate force, striking the intruder squarely and forcing him back. Clarabelle's next shot rang out, echoing through the evening air. The attack outside intensified, testing every barricade we had set. I could hear the desperation in their voices now, an edge of frustration as their initial confidence faltered. We were no longer passive targets. We were active defenders, guided by a legacy that extended beyond our own lifetimes. Each action we took, every decision I made, reinforced the idea that my grandfather's foresight had been extraordinary. In a rare quiet moment, I glanced at the women. Their expressions were a mixture of fear, hope, and trust. They had believed in me before I had even known my own potential. The realization struck me like lightning. I was not just defending the ranch. I was defending their lives, their history, and the promises that had been made long before my own understanding had formed. I moved to the front window again, peering through the slit in the curtain. The men had regrouped, whispering urgently, clearly aware that their attempts at intimidation were no longer working. I noted their positions, their strengths, their overconfidence. Every detail mattered. Every observation, every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The memory of my grandfather's voice returned, almost tangible. Stand when you are needed. Lead when you are uncertain. Protect when you fear failure. That is how legacies endure. And now, for the first time, I truly understood. I was not just a man standing on a porch with 7 women behind him. I was the culmination of generations of careful preparation, trust, and foresight. The night was far from over, and the men outside were persistent, dangerous, and calculating. But for the first time, I felt a sense of control, a measure of clarity amid the chaos. We were ready. The night had fallen into a tense rhythm, punctuated by the harsh sounds of the intruders testing every barrier we had set. My heartbeat echoed the cadence of their approach, a steady drum of anticipation and fear. The men outside were no longer cautious. Their patience had thinned, replaced by a dangerous, erratic boldness. I could hear them whispering sharp, clipped commands to one another, their voices low but intense, carrying over the distant rustle of wind through the trees. They were planning, coordinating, and for the first time, they seemed to understand that the women they sought to intimidate were not the passive targets they had expected. I crouched behind the dining table, peering out through a small slit in the curtain. Clarabelle had positioned herself near the front window, rifle raised, eyes scanning, but I noticed something in the intruder's movements, a pattern, a hesitation. Experience had taught me that the best attackers often left tiny clues, and instinct, honed over years of observing and listening, allowed me to detect it. They were moving toward the back of the house next, anticipating that we would react there. I quickly relayed instructions to the women, moving them to positions that used the house's layout to maximum advantage. Maggie took the loft position to monitor the back, while Mercy stayed near the central table with me, clutching the journal that had become both weapon and guide. Clarabelle adjusted her stance, her sharp eyes calculating trajectories, timing, and angles. For the first time, the house felt like a fortress not just built of wood and stone, but of purpose, strategy, and legacy. A sudden crash from the back startled me. One of the men had tried to force a window that we thought secure. Clarabelle's next shot rang out, precise, forcing him back outside. I felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by clarity. Observation first. Patience second. Strike when necessary. My grandfather's lessons, long buried beneath years of memory loss, were guiding me again. A fragment of memory surfaced unexpectedly. A sun-drenched afternoon when I was 6 or 7, standing beside my grandfather in the orchard behind the house. He had shown me how to observe, how to anticipate movements, how to read subtle signs in both people and animals. It had seemed trivial then, almost playful, but now it was a roadmap. I remembered him saying, "You will need to notice what others overlook. That is the difference between safety and chaos." I instructed Maggie to trigger the trap we had prepared months ago, a series of simple yet effective obstacles, overturned barrels, strategically placed planks that could be used to create noise or conceal movement, and small barricades that could slow any intruder daring to enter. The effect was immediate. One of the men tripped over a plank, cursing loudly, while another knocked into a barrel that toppled with a resounding crash. The confusion bought us precious seconds. The men outside regrouped quickly, realizing the house was more than just a simple target. Their frustration was evident, the edge of panic creeping into their normally confident postures. I noticed that they were communicating rapidly, trying to coordinate a simultaneous assault, but their movements betrayed a lack of preparation for what they had encountered. I moved to the front window with a lantern, keeping the light low but angled in a way that revealed the silhouettes of the men without exposing my own position. My grandfather's words rang in my mind, "Use what you have, and let the world underestimate your resolve. They will always reveal more than they intend." I could see it now. Overconfidence, impatience, and the fatal assumption that we would be passive. A sudden shift in the wind carried their voices differently, and I realized they were preparing to split their forces, two attempting a frontal breach while the third tried to find a weak entry point at the side. I relayed instructions quickly, dividing our defenses with precision. Maggie moved to the loft to monitor the back. Mercy took the central hallway with a heavy iron bar in hand, and Clarabelle adjusted her rifle to cover the expected frontal assault. I took the position at the corner, ready to intervene with whatever means necessary. Then, unexpectedly, another memory surfaced. I was 6, perhaps 7, hiding in the hayloft while my grandfather demonstrated how to remain unseen. He had whispered instructions, teaching me how to anticipate the movements of people larger and stronger than I. The memory was vivid, the creak of floorboards, the subtle sway of the loft, the way light fell through the gaps. I realized now that I could use the same principles against the men outside, exploiting their arrogance and unfamiliarity with the house's intricate layout. The assault began in earnest. 2 men tried to force the front door simultaneously, levering the bar with all their strength. Clarabelle fired a warning shot, the crack of gunfire splitting the night. One of them fell backward, hitting the ground hard, while the second paused, assessing the situation. I moved into action, throwing a lantern toward the front steps. The light and sudden movement caused the second man to flinch, buying us more time. At the back, Maggie had successfully forced one of the men into a narrow choke point, limiting his movement and ability to coordinate with the others. Every action was now guided by instinct, memory, and the careful observations of years I hadn't consciously remembered. In those tense moments, I felt something profound, a connection to my grandfather, to the women, to the land itself. Every decision I made, every movement, was part of a legacy I had once ignored but now fully embraced. Survival was no longer just instinct. It was strategy, awareness, and purpose, all woven together in a tapestry of inherited responsibility. The men outside began to hesitate, sensing the growing coordination of our defense. They had expected fear, chaos, and disorganization. Instead, they were met with calculated resistance, precise movements, and unexpected tactics. My pulse steadied as the realization sank in. We were not merely defending a house. We were defending a promise, a legacy, and lives that depended on our resolve. The night had grown colder, the wind carrying the scent of earth and smoke as shadows shifted across the yard. The men outside were no longer merely testing us. They were attacking with intent, a calculated aggression that demanded immediate and decisive action. I could hear the scrape of boots against the wooden steps, the metallic jangle of weapons, and the faint, desperate muttering of one of the intruders trying to maintain authority over the others. I crouched near the corner, lantern in hand, and watched as two figures forced their way toward the front door, while the third approached the back, testing the reinforced window that Maggie had positioned herself to defend. My pulse pounded in rhythm with their movements, but beneath the fear, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The fragmented memories of my childhood, the journals, and the meticulous instructions my grandfather had left now formed a cohesive map in my mind. Every plank, every creaking floorboard, every shadow had been placed with purpose. I whispered directions to the women, using subtle gestures to maintain stealth and coordination. Clarabelle fired another warning shot, the sharp crack echoing through the darkness and forcing one of the front attackers to stumble back. Maggie, from the loft, had managed to corner the man attempting the back entry, leveraging her position to create a choke point that limited his mobility. I realized then that the house itself was an extension of strategy, every room, hallway, and obstacle part of a living defense system that my grandfather had designed with foresight beyond imagination. As the fight intensified, a memory flickered across my mind, a memory of sitting on my grandfather's knee in the kitchen, listening to him recount stories of resilience, cunning, and loyalty. His voice had been gentle, patient, yet every word carried an underlying lesson. To protect what matters, one must anticipate, observe, and act without hesitation. I could feel those lessons now guiding my hands, sharpening my awareness, and lending precision to every decision. The intruders outside were growing desperate. Their attacks became less coordinated, more reckless. I saw one of them lunge toward the front door, overestimating his strength against the wooden bar and the weight of our preparation. I grabbed a heavy iron poker, swinging it with measured force, striking the man and forcing him to retreat. Clarabelle followed up with a precise shot that sent the second intruder stumbling back into the shadows. The night air was thick with tension, the smell of gunpowder mingling with dust and sweat. Through it all, I could feel the women's eyes on me, their trust anchoring my resolve. Maggie's calm authority, Clarabelle's precision, and Mercy's quiet courage formed a triangle of support that steadied my nerves. I realized that I was no longer merely defending the house. I was defending their lives, the legacy of my grandfather, and a promise that stretched back decades. Then, in the brief lull between assaults, Maggie spoke, her voice calm but carrying weight. She recounted stories of my grandfather's connection to each of the women, how he had protected them, guided them, and created a sanctuary when the world had been unkind. They had been bound together by more than gratitude. They had been bound by trust, respect, and a shared history of survival. The realization hit me. These women had built their lives around the protection my grandfather offered, and now that responsibility had passed to me. As the attackers regrouped outside, I drew upon another memory, one of running through the orchard as a child, my grandfather guiding me, teaching me to notice subtle signs, to read movements before they happened. That memory now translated into instinctive action. I anticipated their next move, signaling to the women to adjust positions. Clarabelle shifted slightly, taking a new line of fire, while Maggie used her vantage to create another choke point at the back. Mercy, clutching the journal, positioned herself near the central hallway, ready to defend or assist as needed. The first major breach attempt came simultaneously at the front and back. The men forced the front door, levering the bar with all their strength, while the third tried to exploit the back window. I acted without hesitation, swinging the iron poker with precision to knock the first man off balance. Clarabelle fired, the shot ringing through the air, and the man fell back, cursing. Maggie's movements at the back were flawless, guiding the intruder into a position where he could do little but retreat. The battle was a blur of movement, strategy, and instinct. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, yet for the first time, I embraced it. Every decision mattered, every action carried consequence, and every memory from my past, fragmented and incomplete, had become a tool in our defense. As the intruders paused, regrouping in frustration and anger, I caught a glimpse of their expressions: overconfidence giving way to fear, arrogance replaced by calculation. They had underestimated us, assumed we were passive and unprepared. They had not counted on the combined experience of 7 women, guided by the legacy of my grandfather, and a grandson who was beginning to understand the weight of promises made long before his comprehension. In that moment, I realized something crucial. This confrontation was not just about defending a house. It was about asserting the enduring power of trust, legacy, and courage. The intruders were formidable, but they were no match for preparation, strategy, and resolve. The sudden silence after the barrage of gunfire was almost deafening. The men outside had retreated, their shouts fading into the cold night air. Dust and debris settled across the room, illuminated by the flickering firelight and the lanterns we had strategically placed. I could feel the tension slowly easing, but not entirely. Every instinct told me this lull was temporary, that they were regrouping, reconsidering, and likely preparing for another, more aggressive attempt. I lowered the iron poker, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The women gathered near me, each catching her breath, eyes wide but alive with cautious relief. Maggie's calm presence radiated reassurance. "They'll be back," she said quietly, her tone firm yet measured. "They always come back. But now we know their patterns, their weaknesses." Her gaze met mine, a silent acknowledgement that I had earned their trust. Mercy opened the leather-bound journal, flipping to pages marked with years of notes, sketches, and meticulous strategies. "Your grandfather, he planned everything," she whispered, awe in her voice. "Every room, every tool, every contingency. They weren't just for defense. They were lessons for you, for us." I leaned over her shoulder, scanning the diagrams of hidden passages, trap placements, and even contingencies for communication in case of a siege. It was staggering how much foresight he had exhibited, how deeply he had anticipated not just intruders, but my arrival and our roles. I traced my finger over the drawings, suddenly understanding why my grandfather had trusted these women so completely. They weren't merely caretakers, they were trained in ways I hadn't realized, each one having internalized years of silent preparation. Each one had been waiting for me, knowing that the moment would come when they would need guidance, someone to unify their efforts and make critical decisions. A memory flickered unbidden. A summer afternoon long ago, my grandfather teaching me how to navigate the hills surrounding the ranch, pointing out vantage points, hidden pathways, and natural cover. At the time, it had seemed like a game, a child's lesson in observation. Now, every detail became critical. I realized he had prepared me for this exact scenario, even if I had no conscious memory of those lessons until now. I moved toward the front window, peering through the curtain at the faint silhouettes beyond the tree line. The men were regrouping, speaking in hushed tones, their confidence shaken but not extinguished. I noted the subtle signs, how one of them shifted weight repeatedly, favoring a leg, signaling discomfort or fatigue, how another continually glanced at the other two, seeking reassurance or coordination. Their tactics were deliberate, yet predictable once observed carefully. "Listen," I said, addressing the women gathered near me. "They're regrouping. They're frustrated, and frustration makes even the most experienced men careless. We have an advantage now. We need to anticipate their next move, not react to it." Their eyes followed mine, absorbing the urgency and clarity in my voice. I felt a flicker of pride, not for myself, but for the unity we had achieved in a matter of hours. Clarabelle adjusted her stance, her rifle aimed at a potential point of entry. "They'll come back from the north this time," she said quietly. "They'll try to divide us, draw us out." Maggie nodded, confirming what I suspected. "We'll use their overconfidence against them," she added, her voice calm but resolute. They've underestimated us. That's our strength. I turned back to Mercy and the journal. I realized that beyond the physical preparations, my grandfather had left coded instructions. Hidden notes within sketches, subtle hints in phrasing, all guiding me toward leadership. He had anticipated my hesitation, my lack of confidence, even my fragmented memories, and yet he had created a path for me to follow, one that required observation, decisiveness, and courage. Another fragment of memory returned, sharper this time. My grandfather sitting in the study, a younger version of myself perched on the edge of a chair, watching him methodically catalogue items, plans, and contingencies. He had spoken then, softly but with authority. One day, someone will need to stand when the world comes to take what is ours. It may be you, Silas. You may not remember, but the responsibility will demand you rise. At the time, the words had sounded like the musings of an old man. Now, I understood. They were instructions, and a promise. The night stretched on, the darkness heavy around the house, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning or the distant rustle of trees. We prepared for the next wave, coordinating positions, checking weapons, and reinforcing weak points. The air was taut with anticipation, every creak and groan of the house amplifying the tension. I felt the weight of the responsibility pressing on my shoulders, yet for the first time, I embraced it fully. I moved through the rooms, checking barricades, confirming positions, and silently acknowledging the trust the women had placed in me. Every glance, every nod, was a reminder that this was no longer just about survival. It was about honor, legacy, and fulfilling promises made decades ago. I realized that the intruders' aggression had revealed more than just their intent. It had revealed the depths of our preparedness, the foresight of my grandfather, and the strength of unity forged in shared purpose. As I returned to the central hall, a sudden thought struck me. This confrontation was far from over, but it was no longer simply defensive. The next engagement would require precision, strategy, and decisive action. I felt a strange calm, a clarity born from the merging of past lessons, present observation, and the unspoken trust of the women who had waited for me. Tonight, the men had tested us. Tomorrow, we would define the terms of our defense, and ensure that the legacy entrusted to me by my grandfather, and protected by these women, endured. The wind had shifted, carrying a sharp chill and the scent of impending confrontation. From the shadows beyond the tree-line, I could hear the men regrouping, their low voices carrying determination and desperation. They had returned, more organized this time, moving in coordinated steps that reflected planning and experience. Their confidence had returned, but now it worked against them. They underestimated the unity and preparation of the women behind me and the knowledge I had inherited. I moved swiftly through the hall, checking positions one last time. Maggie was stationed in the loft, with a clear line of sight across the yard. Clarabelle's rifle was trained on the front door, her eyes sharp and unblinking. Mercy, steady despite her youth, held the journal close but had assumed a tactical role, ready to alert us to any shift or weakness in the attacker's approach. The house itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, the wood and stone echoing the tension that hung like a thick fog. The first assault came like a storm. The men broke through the front barrier simultaneously, levering and prying, but every movement was anticipated. I struck the first intruder with precise force, forcing him off balance, while Clarabelle's shot rang out immediately after, hitting the second. Maggie called out from the loft, guiding our positioning and directing our responses to the attacker's flanking attempts. Memories surfaced in fragments. My grandfather teaching me how to read the subtle signals of aggression, the way shadows could reveal hidden intent, the timing of movements in combat. These lessons, buried deep in childhood, now guided my actions with uncanny clarity. I moved as if guided by instinct, each swing of the iron poker, each instruction, each decision calculated with precision. The intruders hesitated for just a moment, a pause that proved fatal. We struck in coordinated waves, each action synchronized with the others. It wasn't brute force that defeated them. It was foresight, anticipation, and unity. I realized in that moment that my grandfather's legacy was not just the land, not just the women's trust. It was the preparation of a mind to outthink, outmaneuver, and endure. As the last intruder was forced into retreat, the night fell silent once again, the storm of aggression replaced by the weight of victory and exhaustion. I stood among the women, our breathing heavy, bodies tense but alive. For the first time, the responsibility passed to me felt tangible and conquerable. We had defended the ranch, honored promises, and faced the threat together. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling pale gold across the ranch and the mountains beyond. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder, smoke, and earth disturbed by the night's chaos. I stood in the central hall, surveying the aftermath of the confrontation. The intruders were gone, scattered back into the shadows from which they had emerged, leaving the ranch intact and the women alive. Exhaustion tugged at my limbs, but beneath it lay a profound sense of clarity, of purpose finally embraced. Maggie moved beside me, her steady gaze meeting mine. No words were necessary. We had survived because we had acted together, trusted one another, and honored the preparation that my grandfather had laid out long before I could comprehend it. Clarabelle began inspecting the damage, while Mercy carefully returned the journal to its place, as if the continuity of our history demanded it. Each action reminded me that we had not merely defended property. We had protected lives, a legacy, and promises that stretched across decades. I finally allowed myself to look at the ranch as it truly was, not as a mysterious inheritance, but as a testament to my grandfather's foresight. The walls, the rooms, and even the seemingly mundane details of the layout now spoke of meticulous planning, of lessons taught through actions rather than words. Every trap, every hidden path, every reinforced door had been a silent instruction meant to prepare us for moments like this one. A memory surfaced in vivid clarity. The last summer I had spent at the ranch as a boy, playing under the watchful eye of my grandfather, laughing as he demonstrated how to move silently across the orchard, how to notice subtle shifts in the wind, how to trust instincts above fear. At the time, it had seemed like a simple game. Now, I understood it had been preparation, a seed planted to cultivate courage, awareness, and responsibility. The women gathered around me, expressions softening from tension to relief. They had waited for this moment, for me to arrive, for the promise of protection and stewardship to be fulfilled. And now I felt it, a connection not just to the land and its legacy, but to the people who had trusted me before I even knew my own strength. Maggie placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather knew you would rise to this," she said quietly. "Not because you remembered, but because you were meant to. You've honored what he began here." The weight of her words settled over me, heavy yet comforting. I realized that the inheritance was never about land alone. It had been about courage, unity, and the willingness to take responsibility for others, even when unprepared. We walked through the ranch together, assessing the damage and beginning repairs. The sun rose higher, illuminating the mountains, the fields, and the house that had survived not just through walls and barricades, but through trust, preparation, and commitment. I knew that the intruders might return someday, but now we were ready, not just to defend, but to endure. For the first time, I felt a sense of belonging. The ranch was no longer a place of confusion or mystery. It was ours, bound by promises, memories, and the knowledge that courage and foresight could outlast even the most calculated threats. I had inherited more than land. I had inherited purpose, and with it, the strength to protect what mattered most. As the morning light spread across the ranch, I understood something deeply. Survival was not merely about avoiding danger, but about honoring the past, acting decisively in the present, and preparing for whatever the future might hold. And with the women by my side, I knew that the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me was safe, enduring, and alive. If you were in Silas's place, would you have fought the same fight, or walked away from the ranch forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed the story. Your support keeps these tales alive. Now, the story may end here, but the Wild West holds many more secrets. Discover them by exploring the other videos on your screen.